Hi OML gang, I'm Karina. This is Karina's Sewing Room and welcome to my happy place. In this video, I'm going to show you how I make the Gingerbread House bag by Sue Brown from OML Embroidery. I used fleece for the exterior. I used a heavy cutaway stabilizer. I didn't use batting. I used waterproof canvas for the lining. I do not recommend using those materials if you're sewing on a domestic sewing machine. I'm sewing on an industrial sewing machine, so my machine can handle all these layers. But the sewing part of the bag is exactly the same as if I would have done it on my domestic machine. All the tips and tricks, I would have done everything exactly the same. So I show you how to get a beautiful lining that lies flat in the bag, how to match up those scallop edges. I think I did pretty good on matching up those. I'm really happy with the results. So in this video, I'm showing how I make it. So are you ready to start sewing? Let's get to it. So I have all the pieces here ready to sew. It's my handles, front of the house, and the lining that goes with it, the bottom and the lining piece, the sides and the lining piece, and the back of the house and the lining piece. So the first thing I'm going to do is to add this. If you can add it with the embroidery machine. The last step on every design is attaching the scallop edged. But I didn't do that. As you see, I'm using thick fabric and I didn't want to risk it on my embroidery machine. So I got all the exterior here. I'm gonna place the scalloped edge on the edge of my front. No, this is the back. And make sure you place it on the top. It would not be a good idea to place it on the bottom like this. Well, it could be nice, that too. That actually look kind of cozy. But it's supposed to be on the top. And now I'm just going to baste this in place. And when I baste, I increase the stitch length. And I sew 1/8 of an inch from the top. And this will be within the seam allowance. Now, all the sides have the scalloped edge attached. And now we can start attaching. Wait, I'm going to do the handles first and attach them. You can use webbing I am just gonna, I just took, cut the handles from my lining fabric. I'm just gonna fold it in half, fold the raw edges in. You can make the handles as long or as short as you want. I'm going to use some double-sided tape just because I have double-sided tape. And my fabric can be a bit stubborn because it's thick. If you use cotton, you don't have to use double-sided tape. So I put double-sided tape down the middle. And then I fold the raw edges in. First I fold one side and then the other, and then I fold both at the same time. Because then I know that they'll meet and don't leave a gap. I don't have that rickrack that Sue put on her handles. So I'm just going to top stitch the handles before I attach them. Just creasing them over the edge of the table. I'm using waterproof canvas for the lining. It can be sewn on a domestic sewing machine, but it is kind of thick. If you want to use a fabric similar to this, and you have a domestic sewing machine, I recommend water-resistant canvas because that is not as thick as this waterproof canvas. But as I'm using my industrial machine, I can use waterproof canvas. So now I'm just going to top stitch down both sides of this. And when I'm top stitching, I'm increasing the stitch length. I had it on a basting stitch now, but I'm regular sewing on a sewing machine, if you don't have a thick material, is around 2.5, 2.5. And a top stitch can be up to 4. Try around on your machine and see what you like best. And I'm just holding the handle between my fingers. I press my fingers down to the table, holding it in place. And by doing that, I get an even stitch. And by holding the handle like that, I get an even stitch all the way. So now I want to place the handle, and I want to go right sides down because when you lift the handle, you will see the right side. And I don't think Studio had measurements for where to put the handles. You can put them where you like them. I think I'm going to place them 2 inches from the side. Yeah, 2 inches. So I'm just measuring 2 inches from the side, and I'm going to base this in place. And I'm within the seam allowance when I'm basting. So now we're going to start assembling the bag. We have everything prepped. And I'm going to talk about seam allowance. On this project, you can decide what seam allowance you're going to use. And the way you do that, you see the stitch on the back side there at the edge. That should be your seam when you sew it together. And what I mean with you decide the seam allowance, you measure from that line and to the cut line, and that will be your seam allowance. So I have measured 1 centimeter. Well, it's actually, yes, 1 centimeter. And now I don't have markings on my stitch plate. So I cannot do, okay. Yes, I can use the markings I have. So that's how you determine what seam allowance you're going to use. Now we're going to put it together. It doesn't matter if you begin with the front or the back. What does matter is that you match up those scallop edges, because that will be visible if they don't match up. So I'm gonna put some wonder clips on this, and it's more important that the scallop edge match up than that the bottom of the embroidery matched up. And I know what my seam allowance is, so I'm gonna mark. I don't have to. Yes, I am. I'm gonna mark the seam allowance down here, and I use a silver marking pen because it will show up. And I mark that on the back of the fabric that is facing me when I sew it together. So I start at the top, go down to a construction stitch length, back stitch at the beginning and the end. I'm also going to back stitch over the scalloped edge because it's thicker than the rest. And I'm stopping at the marking that I did. Back stitch. And this is just to make it easier to attach the bottom. So now I take the other side, matching up those scalloped edges. And I want to sew from the top down, because then I sew over the scalloped edge first. Make sure those are nice and matched. And this, I think that's approved. I'm pretty happy with that one. Let's hope I get the same results on this one. And I'm making sure to stop at my seam allowance at the bottom. Oops, sorry. And let's see, did I do a good job matching this up? Yeah, pretty happy with that one too. Now, the last side. The reason why I didn't mark the rest um, of the bag like I did on the beginning is because I see the seam allowance down at the end. So I know that I shouldn't sew past this seam allowance. And now we have this gap at the bottom, and it's okay. It's supposed to be that way. I'm going to take the bottom of the bag, and I like to sew the two short edges first. And I'm folding down that seam allowance from the side. The same on this side. Folding that out of the way. And now I'm going to sew from that seam allowance to that seam allowance. And I'm going to squish the bag. And by sewing one side at a time, you don't have to attach the whole bottom and struggle with the corners and everything. So to that seam allowance and stop. I don't have to struggle with the corners and everything. And as you sew, you do sew one side of the time. So now I'm going to jump over to the other side, fold down that seam allowance on the long edge, putting the corners together. The same on this side. And now I'm going to sew from one seam allowance to the other. Trim those threads as you go. it will be easier to keep a clean sewing space. So now the sides, the short sides are attached. I just fold one of the long edges. And I start in the corner, clipping them together. Making sure everything fits nicely. I'm gonna trim down the seam allowance afterwards. I think I'm gonna take a look at them first. Uh, so then I got the long edge attached. I'm gonna sew from this seam allowance to this seam allowance. And this will make the bag sit nicer. Trim the threads, throw them in the bin. Now we only have one more side left, and I'm putting my fingers inside and just pulling on it. And that will open this corner, make it easy to pin them together or clip them together. I use Wonder Clips because this is way too thick for pins. Making sure everything lines up. And I do sew, when I sew the bottom on, I sew with the bottom side up. And I'm just squishing down the bag and starting right at that seam allowance. Back stitch at the beginning and the end. Yes, I know I've said it a million times, but it is that important. So now the exterior of the bag is done, and there are no holes. Even if we didn't sew all the way, I can poke my finger through. So I can see here on the side that the seam allowance actually flattens themselves. But that is only on the sides. So I am going to trim down the seam allowance on the bottom. Let's see, scissors, and I'm going to trim it down. And this will help the lining lay nicely inside of the back. Because it won't be pushed out uh, because of the thickness of the seam allowance. And you may ask why we leave a big seam allowance when we're going to cut it down afterwards. Well, I cut down the seam allowance to about 1/8 of an inch, but it's much easier to sew at 3/8 of an inch than 1/8 of an inch. So that's why we have a bigger seam allowance and cut it down afterwards. Now, this is thick. It's going to be a struggle to sew through afterwards. So we need to cut that down, but we're going to do that after we attach the lining. And I'm not going to show you the bag yet, but it looks really good. So now we start with the lining. And we have the bottom, which is smaller than the other. The front and the back are the same size, and the sides are the same. So I'm starting putting one of the sides on. Put those away. And I know the seam allowance that I had on the exterior. I am going to mark it on this side because, and I'm going to increase the seam allowance on the lining because that will give the lining a snugger fit inside of the bag. You won't get a saggy lining. And I'm also going to mark the seam allowance at the top. I'm going to start at the same seam allowance as on the exterior because we need the bag to fit at the top. But I'm going to sew half an inch, no, about an inch. I'm going to sew down about an inch with the same seam allowance, and then I'm going to increase it just a smidge, and it's not even an eighth of an inch. It's smaller than an eighth of an inch. So I start at that seam allowance, sew down about an inch, and then I'm going to increase it just a bit. And I'm going to sew down to the marking that I made, which is the same seam allowance that I have on the exterior. And I'm going to do the same here. Here I'm going to start from the bottom because I want my bag to be on the left side of the needle. So here I'm going to start at the same seam allowance. No, I'm going to start a bit further in. And I'm going to decrease as I get to the top. So now I am at the stage where I put the bottom of the bag in. And I'm going to do the same. I'm going to start at the short edge. And as the seam allowance here are going to fight me a bit, I'm pulling away the seam allowance on the long side. Flip those together. Actually, I should just mark out the seam allowance on this bottom piece. This is just to make it easier. And yes, I have sewn hundreds of bags, but sometimes I do mark out my seam allowance. Because it just makes it easier nicer, tidier. Like this. Now I mark the seam allowance all the way around. And I've marked them on the bottom of on the bottom panel because I'm going to sew with the bottom panel up. So I'm folding down the seam allowance on the long edge, and I'm clipping the short edge to the sides, to the side panel, and then I'm going to stitch from seam allowance to seam allowance. If you sew all the way out, you're going to have trouble when you're stitching the next side on. So folding down that seam allowance on the long edge, placing the short edge on the bottom panel with the short edge of the side panel, clipping them together, and sew from one seam allowance to the next. So now when I pull on the sides that we have sewn, everything just falls into place. So I'm going to do this side, fold away the seam allowance on the short on the side panel, and just clip it together. Now we are going to leave a birthing hole or a turning hole in this bag. You see how easy that was to clip together because we sewed from the seam allowance to the seam allowance. Everything just falls into place. So I'm starting at that seam allowance, uh, following the lines that I drew. I'm gonna back stitch, sew a couple of inches, back stitch, raise the needle, jump over to this side, back stitch, pull away that side panel seam allowance. So to the seam allowance. No, I'm not going to do that because I'm out of bobbin. So I'm just going to change my bobbin. Cut that thread, bring up the bobbin thread, and we're ready to go again. Snip this threads. So now I'm going to start on this side, back stitch, all the way to the other seam allowance and back stitch. And now we have a nice opening to turn the bag through. Jumping over to the other side, pulling on those side panels, and just folding them down. Everything folds nice and easy. And then we trim down seam allowance. So the lining will sit nicely inside outside the exterior. Now I'm not gonna I am not gonna trim the seam allowance where I didn't stitch at the birthing hole. So I'm gonna trim almost to the birthing hole and just angle out. I'm gonna jump to this side and I'm gonna angle in because I want that bigger seam allowance when I'm sewing this shot. And on the sides, I'm gonna trim from the bottom. And when I get to the top, I'm angling out because I do want a bigger seam allowance at the top because I want to open it and flatten that seam allowance when I put the exterior and the lining together. So I'm starting at the bottom and angling out when I get to the top. So lining is done, exterior is done. So I'm gonna have the exterior right side in. I'm gonna turn this, the lining right side out. Because the lining is a tiny bit smaller than the exterior, I want to put the lining inside the exterior. If I put the lining outside of the exterior, it will pucker because the lining is smaller. So I turned it right side out and I'm just placing it inside the exterior. Now I go to the corners, flatten that seam allowance, those seam allowances. Use my English. English is not my first language. So I'm gonna put 2 clips like that. Go over to the next corner, open up those seam allowance, put some clips on those. To the next corner, open it up. I always do the corners first because I do want the corners to match. Over to this side. And now I'm just gonna put a few clips in between. Make sure the lining is pushed down so the edges, the raw edges meets. So we'll clip on the floor. That always helps. Good for the morale of the sewing. I'm just kidding. So now the lining is inside the exterior. Let's sew all around. And we want to use the same seam allowance uh, that you can see here. But I'm going to sew with the lining side up. And it doesn't matter where you start, as long as you start. And we're going to sew all the way around. Back stitch at the beginning. When I get to where I started, I backstitch, clean up those slips, trim those threads. You see, it's already clean. So now we're going to turn the bag. But first, this is a very thick area. So what I'm going to do, I'm not going to trim down this seam allowance. Because if I leave this seam allowance, it will give the top of the bag a firm edge. But I am gonna trim down this. Oops. And this is just to remove some of the bulk that we will have when we're top stitching. And I'm just cutting down and then angle it up. So I'm cutting off triangle. So it's just in that seam. And I'm going to do the same here, angling down. Don't cut past your stitches. You just want to remove some of the bulk here, because when you top stitch, it's going to double these layers. And by cutting these away, it's going to be so much easier to top stitch. So you can see it's not evenly cut or anything, but it doesn't matter. I've cut down all this seam allowance on the corners. So now I pull out the lining, put my hand through the birthing hole, grab the bottom of the bag. What I do, I make a fist and push it inside my other hand and just starting to turn it right side out. And you don't want to pull too much. You want to ease the bag through the birthing hole or turning hole. In the bag making world, we call this a birthing hole. And push the bag. Push, push, you can do it. And now I'm going to put my hand through that birthing hole and poke out the corners, because it's way easier now. You can get in there and poke, or to do it afterwards. So now the bag looks like this. I'm gonna close up the birthing hole. You can hand stitch this if you like, or you can sew it by machine. And I'm putting my fingers in, dragging, and you can see the raw edges folds in. And I'm just pinching it. And I'm gonna put clips. like that. As I said, you can hand sew it. I'm not going to. I am gonna change my top thread. Now I'm gonna sew along the edge there, and it's about 1/8 of an inch, maybe a bit less. Yes, at the edge, so I can close that. Now we're gonna push the lining into the bag. And I'm gonna roll this edge between my fingers. I'm just gonna put one clip because I have one more thing I'm gonna do to those thick side seams. I'm rolling that seam between my fingers so that the lining rolls to the inside. You don't hear my stomach, it's rumbling like crazy. Yes, I'm hungry. Pushing the lining in as I go to get the lining to lay where I want it to lay. And I'm not doing anything with the sides yet. Not putting any clips there. It is a lot thinner than it would have been if I didn't put, if I didn't cut out the seam allowance, but it's still a bit thick. I know my machine can handle it, but I can help my machine a bit more. And I am going to get, see, this one. It's a pair of pliers, and I have glued some fabric on so the steel don't hurt the fabric that I'm using it on. So what I'm going to do, I am going to roll that seam and I'm going to squeeze as much as I can. And see how much flatter that edge came. You can see here, you can see the difference between this one and this one that I haven't squeezed. So look at this now, how thick it is. I'm gonna squeeze, squeeze, squeeze. Look at it now. It's so much thinner, and the machine is gonna love you for doing this. So now I can top stitch all the way around. And I like to top stitch with the right side up. So I'm gonna squeeze the bag. And this is the front of the bag, so I like to start at the back. And I'm gonna start between that corner and the handle. And when I'm top stitching, I'm gonna increase the stitch length because that makes for nicer stitches. And as we are sewing through multiple layers, it will also be nicer stitches. So I'm back stitching. And I'm just going to sew all the way around. Trim those threads. Kind of sad looking now. But look at this bag. Just gonna move the camera a bit. Hi. So this is the finished bag. Isn't it cute? And because I did increase the seam allowance when I sew the lining, you see the lining is perfectly fitted inside of the bag. The corners on the bottom look perfect because we sewed to the seam allowance, well, from seam allowance to seam allowance, instead of sewing all the way across. And because we matched up those scalloped edges when we sewed the sides to the front and the back, it looks pretty darn good. So this is the gingerbread house bag.